everybody. I'm Katrina Rainin-Woodward, and I have the great privilege of being Program Director at Melbourne Business School's Executive Education. And I'd really like to warmly welcome you, whether you're staff, students, alumni, and guests, to the Intelligence for Business Masterclass, titled Strategic Writing for Clarity and Impact. And I'm delighted to let you know that there are around 600 registrations for today. So you're in a very warm group. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people, who are the traditional owners of the land on which I am today, and pay my respects to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, past and present. I also pay my respects to their communities who shared and practiced their teaching over thousands of years. Melbourne Business School's vision is unleashing leaders for a sustainable future, and we do this by creating and sharing knowledge to help understand, guide, and shape the future of business, government, and the for-purpose sector. So events like today's masterclass offer ongoing leadership and learning and access to contemporary thinking in business and leadership. And it's one of the many ways that we support the broader community and our commitment to lifelong learning. Now, remember the drill. If you have any questions or comments, please use the chat and Q&A function in the webinar, and we'll make sure that we leave some time throughout and at the end of the session to answer your questions. Now, I wonder how many of you, like me, really struggle to gather disparate ideas in a way that makes intuitive sense to someone without the context that I have. If you are like that, this masterclass on strategic writing for clarity and influence is definitely for you. And to lead us through this program, it's my great pleasure to introduce our distinguished guest, Dr. Ariel Kruger. Ari is a research fellow and facilitator at the Hunt Laboratory for Intelligence Research at the University of Melbourne. He's been developing and delivering bespoke training in strategic writing since 2020. And he's worked with organisations right across the spectrum, including government and defence, biosecurity, regulatory industries, and the private sector. Welcome, Ari. We're really looking forward to what you have to say today.
Great. Thank you for that introduction, Katrina. As she said, yes, today we'll be talking about strategic writing for clarity and impact. Today I'm actually going to be speaking to you about a technique to help you write strategically. It's called case argument mapping. Now, argument mapping is a proven technique for improving the clarity and rigor of your arguments. And it is how you can ensure that your strategic writing is easy to follow and has the intended impact. First, though, we will define what strategic writing is. Then we'll look at why so often our writing falls flat. Next, we'll see a real example of writing failing to make impact before looking at an example of the technique in practice. Hopefully, this will serve as insight into what can be achieved by completing the course. Then we'll go over some of what the argument mapping basics are. And unfortunately, that's all we'll have time for today, but I'd really like everyone to come away from this masterclass with something they can use immediately that will improve their writing. To finish up, I'll briefly mention some published studies investigating how useful the technique is and a short overview of how the full course is structured. So, what is strategic writing? Put simply, it's writing with a purpose or goal. If we were to list the main features of good strategic writing, we would say it is goal-driven. All the elements work together to achieve your intended outcome. It's concise. You communicate only what's necessary, no more, no less. It's structured. The content is organized clearly to maximize your chance of achieving your goal. And importantly, it has transparent reasoning. Your logic is made explicit and easy to follow for readers. Now, the purpose of our writing will obviously vary depending on your context, but almost always it is at least one of these high-level goals. The first is that you want to persuade your readers to accept your conclusions. That is, convince readers that your analysis, your assessment, or your recommendations are credible and valid. The second is to drive a specific decision or action. That is, motivate your readers to approve of proposals, allocate resources, or adopt a particular policy. And third, it's to clearly inform your audience. That is, ensure critical information is easily understood by busy decision makers or stakeholders, enabling them to act swiftly and confidently. So that's strategic writing in the ideal. But in fact, what we tend to see isn't really that at all. And we can describe the problem with a lot of writing as being burdened by a curse of knowledge. We become cursed when we learn more about the topic than our reader. We forget or don't make allowances for the fact that they know less than we do. So it becomes increasingly harder to communicate the knowledge we have effectively the more we know about the topic. And we see this all the time. The curse in academia is particularly bad, and I'm sure you have encountered it in your industry. What happens when we're cursed is that we end up with walls of text and evidence dumps, where we unload everything we know on the reader without guiding them through our reasoning. To illustrate the point, just consider this little cartoon. A man on the street in a new city asks a police officer who walks the streets every day for directions. Because the police officer knows so much more than the tourist, the directions will come thick and fast. Go straight until you hit the McDonald's, turn left at the roundabout, under the bridge. And the poor tourist will have no reference or experience, so the directions will end up being incomprehensible to him. And that's the same thing that happens with our writing. Okay, so now I'd like to show you what I mean by an evidence dump, or a piece of writing afflicted by the curse. Here we have a real draft risk assessment from DOOR, which is now known as DAF, I believe. And you don't need to know any of the particulars, just that the purpose of this assessment is to convince a decision maker that the risk of a particular bug, in this case it's a fungus, coming into Australia on table grapes from China is high. Here's what I'd like you to do. I'm only going to give you 1 minute to read this. And while you are, try to imagine yourself as a decision maker. Why should you believe that the risk is high? And if you can't read it easily on the slide, there should be a link in the chat for a clearer version. So I'll give you a minute starting now and get back to you shortly.
Help, I'm drowning.
Okay, that is actually a minute. So now I want you to do the same thing with this version. It was produced using the case argument mapping approach, what you'll learn in the course. Now, this version has all the same information as the last, but obviously there are many important differences. Again, I'm going to give you 1 minute to go through it, imagining you're the decision maker. So I'll start that now, and then I'll get back to you. Okay, that is about a minute. So I'd like to hear from you about the differences between the two. What did you notice? Which one was better or worse? And more importantly, and this might sound like a weird question, but how did you feel when reading the different versions?
Can I just share, Ari, that Kate came up straight up and said, TMI, too much information.
Too much information. Yep. Although there's the same amount of information in both of them. They're just structured a little bit differently.
Alyssa suggests that number 2 had fabulous headings. Kylie,
Headings, yep.
It was argument focused.
Mhm.
Goodness me, 600 of us. The responses are coming in thick and fast.
Yeah, I can see them as well, actually. Second version was clearer. What about how did you feel when reading the first one? What emotions kind of were brought up? Less stressed. The first one made you feel stressed. Yep, that's typically what we see. Confusion. Yep. Overwhelming. Yep. Frustrated. Confused. Oh, yep. This is all what we expect to see. So that's absolutely right. And especially if you're a decision maker, imagining having to go through, 10 of these a day, you would just get absolutely bogged down and want to quit your job immediately. And there's actually a lot going on here. And I'll quickly explain the major features of the version produced with case argument mapping. And a lot won't make sense to you right now, obviously, because you haven't taken the course. So don't worry too much if you're not sure what the words mean. There should also be a link in the chat for a clearer to read version of this if it's a bit hard to see on the slide. All right, let's start with the major features. We start with the conclusion, or in our terminology, the contention. Sometimes it's called the bluff, and I saw someone said that in the chat, or bottom line up front. And the reason is we want the reader to know immediately what it is we're arguing for. We don't want them to have to sift through the entire document to get the point that we're trying to make. Then we have a very short paragraph that gives the high-level version of our entire argument. That way, even if the reader stops right there, they get the gist of it. Next, you'll notice what we call the high-level reasons, and these are the sentences in bold. The idea is that the reader just needs to read those to understand why they should believe the contention. The other major feature is the use of indentation. Everything nested below the text in bold supports the text in bold. That is, if you want to know why you should believe the high-level reasons, you just need to look below them. And if I want to know why I should believe that this bug, G. uvicola, is present in Indian grape-growing regions, that's the first high-level reason. The first sub-argument, I just have to look below that claim. Finally, or second to finally, the use of bullet points. In this version, bullet points are always and only used for items of evidence. This consistency helps the reader navigate the document. If they want to know what specific facts have been gathered, they just have to look at the bullet points. Unlike the first version I showed you, where the bullet points were used to indicate something like a new paragraph, and so weren't really doing anything at all. Now, the other terms here that we won't get to today, like bridge and sub-reason, but they are critical to ensuring that our reasoning is valid, and we go into that in the full course. So how do we get to this better version? As I've said, we use argument mapping, specifically a version of argument mapping tailored for producing clear and impactful strategic writing. It's called CASE, and it allows us to clearly state what we're arguing for. This is important because all too often, the point we're trying to make gets buried by evidence. It also allows us to take the cognitive load off our reader by structuring the argument and evidence logically. We can think of case argument mapping as the board on which a game is played. Imagine trying to play tic-tac-toe, or I think it's also called noughts and crosses, without writing anything down. You have to hold in your head all the moves made in order to place your piece, and this makes it far more demanding. It also allows us to provide shortcuts for decision makers to access only the information they need. You don't want your line manager or any decision maker to sift through your writing to find the information they need to make a decision. Case will show you the techniques to highlight the important information. Fourth, it allows us to unearth hidden assumptions and tighten our reasoning. Argument mapping is a very powerful tool that, if done correctly, can show you exactly where your assumptions are, and more importantly, how to make them explicit. And finally, it gives us a shared language we can use to evaluate each other's work. This last point is often overlooked, but can lead to big improvements. A lot of what you'll learn in the course and today won't actually be totally new to you, as most of us have a fairly decent intuitive grasp of the concepts. But unless you've taken a logic course at university or something like that, we don't have the language to describe these concepts. Case will equip you with that understanding so you can critique more effectively. Also, I should just mention that this technique has extremely broad applicability. Basically, anytime you have to write anything argumentative, that is, convince your reader to believe your conclusion, then this technique will help. So, what is argument mapping? Simply put, it's visually representing our reasoning using a few rules and conventions. Case is the argument scheme, or in other words, how you lay out your writing. And it stands for contention, argument, evidence, and source. And we just switched the ENS around because it sounds better and there's no rule saying you can't. Now, the image on the right here is the ideal shape you want your map to look like, a well-balanced pyramid. Each layer is supported by multiple boxes, which doesn't just result in a strong shape, but a strong piece of writing as well. We'll go through what each of these elements are again in a moment, but for now, notice how the boxes and arrows operate. A green box and arrow means it supports the claim above. A red box and arrow means it undermines or objects to the claim above. Now let's look at the most basic case argument that shows the elements. We have the contention up top, the C. Then we have the argument, the A. And the argument consists of either and both reasons and objections. Then the E, the evidence. And finally, S, the source or reference for the evidence. Now, a contention needs to be a contestable proposition. And we'll come back to this in a moment. In this example, we've got the Prime Minister is in trouble. Although judging by the polls recently, he may not really be. Then the argument, which are the general or abstract reasons to believe the contention. In this case, it's the opposition is more popular. Next, the evidence, which is the specific information that supports the reason. Here, it's the opposition is ahead in the polls. So hopefully you can see how the opposition is ahead in the polls is more specific than just the opposition is more popular. And finally, we have the source or reference for the evidence, which is just a Fairfax Ipsos poll. And that's it. That's the most basic argument that features the case elements. Case arguments can and will be a lot more complex than this in the real world, and they'll feature other elements like objections and counter evidence. But for now, it's enough to understand how the basics work together. I'd like to go through another example with you, this time from a real argument, but a real simple argument. And I like this example because the author does a really nice job at following the case structure unintentionally. So it's easy to see how the elements operate in this argument. I'll give you about a minute or so to read it, and then we'll go through the elements again. Okay. So let's start with the contention. It's what we start with, excuse me, and it needs to be a contestable claim. Contentious in some way in that it requires argument and evidence to believe. For example, something like Melbourne is better than Sydney rather than Melbourne is a city in Victoria. Melbourne is a city in Victoria isn't really contentious. It's a simple fact that doesn't require an argument to believe, just a map and not an argument map. We call it a proposition because it has to be capable of being true or false. In other words, it can't be a question or a declaration. Argument maps don't start with, let's go to the pub, for example. In the rats example, the public should be concerned about a rising rat population as our contention. In the original text, it's posed as a question. So we need to modify it slightly so that we're following the conventions. Next, we have the argument layers, and they are the muscle that does all the heavy lifting. It consists of the general or abstract reasons or objections to believe or disbelieve the contention. In most examples that aren't for demonstrations, you will have multiple argument layers. That is, multiple reasons and objections that support or object to the ones above. Notice also the color conventions again. When a claim supports the one above, it's green. When it objects to the one above, it's red. In our rats example, we have 3 separate reasons to believe that the public should be concerned about a rising rat population. All 3 are green, so we know immediately that they are in support of the contention, rather than objections to it. We've got the rising presence of rats as an economic issue, an aesthetic issue, and a public health issue. Something else to note. These are separate reasons, and by that we mean that each, on their own, is capable of supporting the contention. Obviously, the case is made stronger the more reasons you have, but in a logical sense, they are not connected with each other. And that becomes important when we discuss things like bridging claims and co-premises, which we get into in the full course. Next, we have the evidence layer. Evidence in case argument mapping is defined as the most specific facts we've gathered in support of our reasons or objections. You can also have counter evidence that objects to the argument layers. The key point here is that evidence is more specific than the argument. And there's a very good logical reason for this that we go into more during the course. You can see in our rats example that we've managed to form a really nice pyramid of reasoning. Each reason is supported by at least 2 items of evidence, which makes the case a convincing one. Now, in this example, we don't have any counter evidence, so all the items are green because they support the reason above. What we saw in the biosecurity example was evidence all over the place, sometimes starting a paragraph and other times buried beneath it. By following the rule that evidence should be more specific than arguments, you can go a long way to improving the structure of your writing. Finally, we have the source, which is simply where the evidence comes from. In our rats example, it's all from Bruce Colvin, the rat catcher. This part is easy, but still important. All items of evidence should have a source, so if anyone wants to, they can easily find where you got it from.
Ari, may I ask a question?
Sure.
To what extent do you think you need to acknowledge the other side of the argument?
If you can anticipate an objection, you should have it in there. This is incredibly important with all argumentative writing, because if someone's going through your argument and they think of an objection and you haven't noted it, that detracts from the entire point of the piece. So we always recommend including anticipated objections and actually starting with them. So we go into that in the full course, but there's structures that you can adopt that will make your objections obvious, but also explained away in the sense that your contention can still be believed.
Thank you.
Let's do a poll to check our comprehension so far. So I've given you a short toy argument below, and I want to know which of these 4 claims on the right are the contention. Is there a poll coming up?
It's
People?
in the chat.
Oh, okay. Oh no, there's a poll now. So you guys can use that one as opposed to the chat.
It's worth noting that there's a wide range of responses.
Yes. Okay, so I can see the results here, and there's a bit of a spread. So let's kind of go through them. A diet. Oh no, it's gone now. Oh, it's back again. A diet rich in vegetables can lower cholesterol. Okay, so 22% of us think that this is the contention. It's not that one. The next one, we should all be eating more vegetables. This is the correct answer. This is the contention. And we know this because I guess it's the most contentious statement. It's the thing that requires evidence and argument to believe. It's not the first one because that is quite specific. It seems like a piece of evidence. Same with the third one. Eating more vegetables is better for our health. And it's certainly not the last one. There is a contention there. So if we were to structure this with case argument mapping, we would start with, we should all be eating more vegetables. Then we would have our general reasons. Why should we be eating more vegetables? Well, eating more vegetables is better for our health. But why should we believe that it's better for our health? Well, a diet rich in vegetables can lower cholesterol. So that's the basic structure. Let's try this another one. What's wrong with this case argument map? And there should be a poll that comes up as well. There you go. Okay, hopefully the results will come up shortly. Yep, there we go. All right. Now, most of us got this right. So well done. 59% of us recognize that the problem with this argument map is that the evidence is more general abstract than the reason. So let's look at this. The evidence just says he confessed to the crime. And the reason has all the specific information about that confession. So really, the argument map should be ordered the contention, obviously, and then the evidence should actually be the reason, and the reason should be the evidence. And that is because the evidence needs to be more specific than the reason. And it's not the first one, the contention isn't contestable, it's beyond doubt. It is probably contestable because there's an argument and evidence to try and convince you to believe it. So well done for those who got that one right. Now let's just do one more. This one's a little bit trickier. And I'm going to give you a few moments to read this argument, and then I'll show you 3 maps. I want you to select which one best represents the reasoning in the map and follows the case conventions. Sorry, best represents the reasoning in the argument and follows the case convention. I've just noticed a typo. It says the thank is obsolete in modern warfare. It should read the tank is obsolete in modern warfare. So apologies for that.
Ari, could you remind us of the task, please? I've had a good read. What am I doing?
Sure. Now I want you to pick which of these maps best represents that argument.
Thank you.
And there should be a poll that'll come up with just 1, 2, or 3. Is there a poll?
Can pop a poll up now. I love it. Jay says, you're really making us think about things on a Friday. I'm a bit the same. I'm looking at them trying to discriminate. Lindsay, could we have the poll, please?
Hi, Ari and Katrina. I can't get it to launch on this occasion.
Oh, that's a shame. That's okay.
We've got numbers coming through the chat.
We've got numbers coming through. And by the looks of things, the vast majority have got it right. So the correct answer is 2. So everyone did that? Yep, 2 based on structure alone. That's all you need to know. 2 is right because we have the reasons up the top supported by evidence. It's not 1 because the evidence and counter evidence comes directly after the contention, and that's the wrong way around. Reasons don't support evidence. Evidence supports reasons. And it's not 3 because everything on that is on the same level, and that's not right either. So well done for everyone who got that one right. Notice something else, actually. We've got some counter evidence in this one on 2. So if the reason is that the reason to believe that the tank is obsolete is that modern conflict favors urban and asymmetric warfare, where tanks are vulnerable to ambushes and guerrilla tactics, the counter evidence is something that says, well, actually, no, that's not the case. Here's an example of something in which that enhances battlefield resilience against guerrilla tactics and ambushes. So that's just quickly how the counter evidence works there. So I just want to go through quickly again, because hopefully this will make a little bit more sense to you. And just focus on the first bit up until, and it is highly likely that some infected grapes will be packed for export. So hopefully more, although not all, will make sense to you. And notice how we're following the case order. We've started with the contention, the thing we're arguing for. Then we have our reason, the high-level reason. Then a sub-argument, which is just a less abstract reason. And directly underneath that, we've got our specific items of evidence properly sourced. So simply by following that ordering of the elements, we can make our writing so much clearer. And there's a better chance it'll have the impact we desire. So we've actually just covered, most of the argument mapping basics. We've got that an argument map consists of box and arrow diagrams that represent your reasoning. Green boxes and arrows mean it supports the claim above, while red boxes and arrows means it objects to it. You can and will have many layers of argument within your map, and these layers will consist of reasons and objections. Claims should get more specific the further you go down the map, terminating in the evidence layer, which is the most specific set of facts that you've gathered. And if all you take from this masterclass are the above points, and in particular how the elements are ordered, you'll see a big improvement in the clarity and impact of your writing. And I just want to say quickly that it's not the case that for every piece of writing, you'll have to develop a map. Once you kind of get the hang of this and you master it, then you can kind of skip the mapping part because you'll have an intuitive sense of what goes where. And you can just jump straight into the writing. But I'd briefly like to mention some research into argument mapping and evidence that it works. You shouldn't just take my word for it. There has been a lot of research into argument mapping, and by and large, it proves that it is a powerful tool for improving the clarity and rigor of written arguments, and more besides. So first, a little shameless self-referencing. We conducted a study of the difference that case made within a government organization when it was implemented over a few years. So we looked at reports produced before and after the intervention and had them assessed independently. And we found that reports produced after the intervention were easier to follow and more rigorous. We also found that the organization was, in fact, able to change the way that reports were structured, which can often be particularly difficult as structuring of reports is one of those things that tend to become entrenched. Next, we have some research showing that argument mapping improves critical thinking generally. So this research has been going on for decades now, and each time shows that it works, provided, of course, that it's done properly and with enough practice. Most of these articles did pre and post testing, and they found big improvements on things like critical thinking tests, as well as things like essay quality. Okay, so here's how the full course is structured. We've covered some of the case basics today, but left out some really important points about objections and counter evidence, which we go into in the full course. We also do a lot of practice, both with toy examples to get you comfortable, but also with real examples from your organization, which can be sanitized if necessary. And that's actually an important point about the full course. The whole thing is designed with practicality in mind. It isn't a course about theory or history or even philosophy, even though we do use philosophical principles. It's a course designed to improve strategic communication in practice. So as much as possible, we use examples and exercises that are centered around what you do. So after the basics, we move on to the principle of abstraction. We talked a little bit about this today, but didn't go into it in any detail. Abstraction is what governs the vertical structure of the map. It's how we can tell what belongs in the argument layers and what in the evidence. It's a key component to ensuring that our writing is easy to navigate. Oh, sorry. Then we move on to what are called bridging claims or co-premises. Now, maybe some of you noticed, but there were big problems with all of the toy examples we looked at today. They all had assumptions littered through them that a careful reader would be quick to pick up on. And so often, this is a major reason why our writing fails to make an impact. When a reader notices important assumptions are left implicit, it makes your writing far less convincing. Instead of focusing on what you've written, they focus on what you've left out. And that can be really damaging to the impact your argument has. In the full course, we'll learn techniques for uncovering assumptions and making them explicit, so your reader isn't left wondering why you've left something out. And I've talked a lot about argument mapping, but not much about writing. And in the full course, we spend quite a bit of time going from the argument map to prose. The good news is that once you've got the map, the prose really comes easily because you've done all the hard work. There are certain conventions and rules that you'll learn that will help you transform an argument map into a well-reasoned piece of writing, like I showed you earlier in the presentation. And finally, it's good to finish the course with applying the technique on your own, preferably to your own work. You can then submit that and get individual feedback on what you've done right and where you can improve. Before we finish up, I'll just talk briefly about the software that you can use to construct argument maps in case any of you want to go away from this and give it a go. First is an easy-to-use PowerPoint macro that is available with the course. It allows you to construct case argument maps directly in PowerPoint with no need for external software. Then there's also MindMap Argument Visualization. This is a browser-based application that is simple and easy to use. It has all the case elements in it, but they may be labeled a little bit differently. Then there's Rationale. It's another browser-based application, but it is a more powerful tool. And it can be used to create advanced argument maps and has additional features over MindMap. It's subscription-based, but there should be a trial version you can play with. And I'll just mention AI is obviously coming along in leaps and bounds, but unfortunately, it's not quite there yet for argument mapping. It does do a reasonable job at differentiating the elements and organizing them, but it requires a lot of checking because it often gets it wrong. And in terms of turning prose into an argument map, it's really got a long way to go. I actually tried it earlier today with the example in the poll, and this is what it gave me, which is not very good at all. So yeah, that's it. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you've learned a little something practical that you can take away and use in your own work. And I also hope I'll get to meet you in person one day if you take the course. And now I'm happy to take questions.
Terrific, Ari. Thank you. And the questions are certainly coming in. Just one from Jacob that I think it just reflected what my thinking was. He's wondering how important is empathy when writing for the audience? Deliberately and consciously trying to think through the perspective of your target audience. And has it shaped how you've written previously? And if so, do you have some examples? Where's empathy? It feels like it's a very rational, sort of logical process that you've outlined. What about empathy and that side?
So that kind of thing will depend so much on your own context of your work. What we kind of teach is the logical structure that can be easily tweaked and modified to match the kind of impact that you want to have. Once you've got that logical structure down, as I said earlier, the rest does actually come quite easily. So you can tweak it to match how you want your audience to receive it. We'll give you what we call the strict case structure, and that underpins all arguments pretty much. And from there, you can then modify it and adjust depending on how your writing style is, or your own individual flair. All those kind of things can be added.
And I guess what that implies is that you can write a persuasive argument this way, and you can have an emotional feeling about things. I mean, my first response was, well, what's wrong with rats after all? How would I read that example? They're cute, right? They're furry. They remind us of nature. So actually you can write, it doesn't mean you're correct. It means that you are structuring your argument in a particular way. Exactly.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So once you've got the structure down, it's much easier to communicate what you're actually thinking as opposed to anything else.
I'm just going to say one thing right now. There's a lot of interest in the course, Ari, and we will be sending out a link to information at the end of this session. So anyone who's wondering about whether this course is going to be available and online and all of those sorts of questions, we will respond to that at the end of the session. In the meantime, there's another question about how you use graph figures in your writing, and should it follow the same structure?
Graph figures, so like charts and
Yeah, I'm
that's what I mean?
imagining the visual within the report.
Yeah. So those kind of things would be classed as evidence items. So they would be used to support a broader argument, but there's a space for those in this kind of writing. Yes.
Okay. And Sammy's wondering how you might use case in an email where shorter arguments are required.
Yeah, it's a great thing to do for an email. You just follow the structure, but you may not have that many argument layers and you may not have that much evidence. And that's fine. So like the earlier example I showed you about the Prime Minister, that could form a fine email that would be more convincing than if you mixed up the ordering of the elements.
Yeah. And a point of clarification, did you mean mind map or mind map?
No, I meant mind MUP, M-U-P. I don't know why it's called that, but if you just Google it, but make sure you Google mind MUP argument visualization, because there are two versions, and it's the argument visualization one you want.
Terrific. And just a comment from Cecilia, it can also be seen as a way to nudge people to a specific decision. So she's wondering about the place for brainstorming and collective discussion. Where does that come through? I imagine prior to your writing.
Yes. So you probably will never get the argument map right first time, which is why software is actually really helpful for this kind of thing, because it allows you just to delete and move things around. And so what I like to do in the beginning stages is just collate the evidence. So I'll create lots of little boxes of evidence. And then from there, I can abstract, and we'll teach you how to do this in the course, abstract the reasons that then link those items of evidence to the contention that you're trying to make. So yeah, there's a big place for brainstorming, but what you don't want is you don't want your argument map to look like the initial brainstorm. So you just want to keep that as a beginning part. Yeah.
Yeah. And I love Rain's question about how you decide which counter arguments to preempt. Do we just think of the most intuitive ones, or do we find the ones most quoted with the most evidence? How rational are we about finding those counter arguments?
That's a good question. And unfortunately, there's no like logical rule that we can apply to this to give us the answer. This is going to be a judgment call, and depends on your understanding of the material as well as the point you're trying to make. Yeah, so unfortunately, there isn't something like a rule we can apply for that.
Yeah, well, it was worth a question, wasn't it?
Yes, for sure.
Look, that's just been such an amazing lunchtime masterclass today, Ari. Thank you. And the thanks are pouring in on the chat, and we do thank everyone for coming. And thank you for sharing your insights and introducing those skills in a way that makes them feel very accessible and very applicable in the next days. So if you've enjoyed this session today, of course, there is more in another opportunity to have a more in-depth dive into the skills and the techniques that improve rigor, clarity, and the impact of professional reports. And we will share the details of that course. And I understand, Ari, that's something that you can customize for clients as well.
For sure. In fact, it's very important that we do. So if you do decide to take the course, we'll have a meeting with you prior to it and kind of understand your context and understand the kind of writing you do and all that kind of stuff, such that the course is tailored to your particular needs. Okay. Well, thanks, Ari. Hunt Lab is becoming very quickly a very good friend of MBS. And thank you for Jane McAleer for the introduction. Looking forward, our next session in the series with the Hunt Lab is with Dr. Ashley Barnett on May the 2nd. And his masterclass will focus on critical thinking skills. And I did love one of the comments about in the chat that someone said, I sort of did this when I was doing debating at school, but I didn't realize what I was doing. So now we've got a framework for it, and I suppose a sense that we were doing the right thing. Now, what Ashley's going to be doing is unpacking two really useful techniques for improving the quality of debates and analytical discussions. And we really do hope to see you there. And in the meantime, just wish you all a happy Friday and a wonderful weekend. And we'll be thinking about my next piece of writing with you in my diary. Thank you very much. Thanks, everyone.
Bye all.